Welcome to the 700 Club. Fighting the only democracy in the Middle East doesn't make you woke. That's how Israel's prime minister called out countries that recently condemned the Jewish nation in his address to the UN General Assembly. Naftali Bennett also reviled Iran for its nuclear weapons program, and he denounced the funding of terrorist groups that target Israel. Chris Mitchell has that.
Like Benjamin Netanyahu before him, Naftali Bennett called on the world to pay attention to Iran and its threat to the Jewish state.
Israel is quite literally surrounded by Hezbollah, Shia militias, Islamic Jihad, and Hamas. What do they all have in common? They all want to destroy my country, and they're all backed by Iran. Iran seeks to dominate the region and seeks to do so under a nuclear umbrella.
Bennett's main priority? Stopping Iran's nuclear program, and he wants international help to do it. He laid out his case, pointing to how Iran is defying the UN's own nuclear monitoring agency and crossing red lines, such as how it's enriched uranium at nearly weapons-grade level.
We cannot tire. We will not tire. Israel will not allow Iran to acquire a nuclear weapon.
Bennett, who met with leaders of the UAE and Bahrain for the first time, thanks to the Abraham Accords, described the new regional relationship as a bright light. Yet he called out countries that joined a recent UN conference condemning Israel.
Fighting the only democracy in the Middle East doesn't make you woke. Adopting cliches about Israel without even bothering to learn the basic facts, well, that's just plain lazy.
Bennett began his speech by referencing the prophetic restoration of the Jewish people.
We are an ancient nation, returned to our ancient homeland, revived our ancient language, restored our ancient sovereignty. Israel is a miracle of Jewish revival. Am Yisrael Chai, the nation of Israel, is alive, and the state of Israel is its beating heart.
Well, Chris is joining us from Jerusalem now. And Chris, we see Naftali Bennett, an interesting speech, very articulate. How far does he differ from Benjamin Netanyahu?
Well, not only does he differ in some respects, Pat, but the government that he leads right now differs quite substantially from Netanyahu's. Perhaps the biggest difference in policy is their negotiations with the Palestinians. For example, Foreign Minister Yair Lapid, he wants his two-state solution. And what this does, Pat, is expose a number of the internal contradictions within the Naftali Bennett government. You have the center, the left, they're pushing for the peace process. Bennett and the others on the right, they're on record of opposing a Palestinian state. And, you know, in Bennett's address to the UN, it was odd that he never addressed the Palestinian issue. So it's a very diverse government. It just passed 100 days. So you have the far left, the far right, and, by the way, Pat, an anti-Israeli Islamist party. And so the question a lot of people are asking, can it last? How can two walk together unless they be agreed, or 8 as it is, because there's 8 parties represented? And perhaps the larger question, Pat, would be, how will Iran respond to the perceived weakness of the government here in Jerusalem, but also in Washington, D.C.?
Chris, the key thing in the Abraham Accords is they totally bypassed the Palestinian Authority and didn't even deal with that two-state stuff. There is no way that there's going to be a two-state solution in Israel. I'm surprised the government doesn't understand that.
I mentioned it before, Pat, but, you know, your Herzliya address many years ago made that point. That was Yasser Arafat was then leader of the Palestinian Authority, and it's a bit of a cruel chimera, as you said, that there would be a two-state solution. They don't seem to, or they either ignore or don't seem to recognize the fact for many Palestinians, including the Palestinian Authority, it's a religious issue, and it's an idea that land once controlled by Islam has to be retaken by Islam. For example, example, Yair Lapid, he wants to economically incentivize Hamas in Gaza to be able to have peace. Well, Hamas is dedicated to destroying Israel. That's part of their DNA and part of their Islamic DNA. So whether or not they can get this and bridge this, thinks like it's a bridge too far because of all these major spiritual and religious differences.
Chris, thanks for your insight. Well, in other news, no holds barred and virtually wide open. Complete lawlessness rules at our southern border. Capitol Hill correspondent Abigail Robertson spoke with one Texas lawmaker who says it's time for serious action. She also brings us an update on the relentless spending battle going on in Congress.
Texas Congressman Michael Cloud tells CBN News his state is completely overrun by what's happening at the border and says it's time the Biden administration takes it seriously.
5 of the 13 counties I represented have already declared a disaster.
CBN News joined Cloud on a tour of the border last June. Cloud says since then, things have only gotten worse.
The federal government's not cooperating with local agencies, so it's our hospitals that are left to deal with it. It's our schools that are left to try to figure out how to deal with the situation. There's new diseases that have been virtually eradicated from the U.S. for quite some time that we're now having to deal with once again. And so this is a very serious situation.
Cloud claims it's complete lawlessness at the border.
You look at what's happening at the border, and it's just no holds barred, virtually open borders. The effort to intentionally overwhelm our system so that it collapses is really tragic coming from this Biden administration.
The Biden administration claims they are doing the best they can under current immigration laws.
First and foremost, and most fundamentally and foundationally, we are dealing with a broken immigration system, and we need legislative reform. And everyone agrees.
Key parts of President Biden's agenda are in jeopardy, even after progressive and moderate Democrats announced a framework agreement over what could be a $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation bill.
Well, it may not be by the end of the week. I hope it's by the end of the week. But as long as we're still alive, we got 3 things to do: the debt ceiling, the continuing resolution, and the 2 pieces of legislation. If we do that, the country's going to be in great shape. Thank you very much.
And last night, Senate Republicans blocked a bill that would fund the government through December and prevent a shutdown on Thursday because that bill included a raise to the debt ceiling, which Republicans do not support. Now, with the threat of a looming government shutdown this week, Democratic leaders have hinted that they might propose a standalone bill to fund the government and save the debt ceiling issue for another day. Pat?
Abigail, Nancy Pelosi is trying to bring her members together to pass that infrastructure bill, but it's monstrous what they're asking for, and what the so-called squad wants is just crazy, and the stuff they put in it is a socialist dream. What happens if she can't get it going in the House?
Well, right now, the House is debating that infrastructure bill. But as you said, the problem that they have here, while almost all Democrats say they support the infrastructure bill, and there's even about 24 House Republicans who plan to vote for it, the problem is that progressive Democrats, there's about 40 of them, are withholding their votes on the infrastructure bill until an agreement is reached on that $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation plan that Democrats are going at alone. And the squad and the progressive Democrats want assurances that that bill will pass both the House and Senate, which both are only narrowly controlled by the Democratic Party. And there's a lot of issues that the centrist and progressive Democrats right now have not come to an agreement on that might hold up that bill. And until they know that that bill is going to pass, they're not going to vote for this infrastructure bill. But Democrats really need to prove that they can govern when they have control of the House, Senate, and White House. President Biden desperately needs to win, and this infrastructure bill is done. There's not really any changes that anyone wants to see in the Democratic Party. All it needs to do is pass the House and be signed by President Biden, but that might not happen this week. Speaker Pelosi says it will likely be voted on Thursday, but she has also made it very clear that if she doesn't have the votes to pass it, she's not going to call for that final vote. And if it doesn't pass this week, sure, it could pass down the line, but Democrats would certainly lose a lot of momentum of getting it across the finish line, and as they're trying to negotiate that larger bill. So we'll just see what happens.
Thanks, Abigail. Ladies and gentlemen, what we've got to recognize is the Democrats want the border to be porous. They want all these undocumented people to flood into our country because their feeling is that if they get them in, they'll vote for the Democrats, and therefore it'll be an advantage. They don't want to close the border. They want this monstrous thing, and they kept it all quiet until the news was so blatant with all those Haitians that the American people began to say it's a monstrous thing. They didn't even call it a crisis until after the pictures showed clearly what the problem was. Now, with this infrastructure thing, it will kill the American economy because they've got to raise taxes in order to pay for it, and it can't get paid for. They claim that it's paid for itself, but that's just nonsense. It is a monstrous social agenda that would move this country toward the path of socialism, and that's what you've got. You've got an avowed socialist who's head of the Senate committee that the Democrats have put in that place, and he spent his honeymoon in Moscow. And you've got this man who's leading the charge to socialize America, and America doesn't want it. So what are we going to do? Well, we can sit there and wring our hands, or we can get praying, and we can get hold of our congressman and let them know we cannot have this socialist agenda. Well, there's something else. You've been hearing all this business about defund the police, defund the police. Well, also in the news, America's deadliest year in more than half a century. That's what the FBI is calling 2020. And while the world was dealing with COVID and civil unrest, homicides in the United States hit an all-time high. Well, what's the major reason for this alarming spike? CBN correspondent Brody Carter has the answers.
More than 21,500 people were murdered in America last year. The pandemic and higher gun sales among the reasons considered for the surge in violence. One other factor, the high number of police officers leaving the force in cities across the country.
The FBI's annual report on crime shows murders in 2020 jumped by almost 30% over 2019. That's roughly 5,000 more homicides, and the numbers are only going up.
People in communities need to start speaking up and getting angry.
Contrary to popular belief, murder isn't just a big city issue. In 2020, we saw a national phenomenon with a 20% increase in each region of the country. Louisiana led the nation for the 32nd year in a row.
When you decide to defund the police, when you decide to make proactive policing nearly impossible, when you run out officers, guess what happens? You see a rise in crime.
Jason Rantz, one of Seattle's leading conservative voices, says the shocking rise in violent crime is a direct response to the murder of George Floyd, social activists working to defund police, gang activity, and the death of America's police force.
Why would anyone want to be a cop in 2020 and 2021? Why would anyone want to sign up for a job that is being made difficult and more dangerous on purpose?
For the most part, police morale appears bankrupt. During a year of crime and protests, police retirements rose 45% and resignations were up by 18% in 2020.
When you tell local law enforcement agencies that you are ineligible for money, that's defunding the police. When you reduce funding for police, you actually lose lives in the communities.
Senator Tim Scott says he's still waiting at the table after Democrats walked away from the chance to pass bipartisan federal police reform. Meantime, more than 20 major cities have reduced police budgets, amounting to some $840 million cut nationwide.
It's the big blue cities where they have failed to pass policies that protect their most vulnerable communities.
Unfortunately, both Senator Scott and Rantz believe more violence is inevitable if we can't get the best people behind the badge.
If you were to take a position that's pro-police, you immediately are called out. You are shamed, you are bullied. There are activists, a small number of them, who have a lot of power right now, and their goal is to abolish the police. Well, we're living in a world in which we're starting to see the fruits of their labor, and unfortunately, we're seeing a lot of dead bodies.
It's important to note the murder rate could be even higher since the numbers are incomplete, with about 3,000 departments failing to submit data to the FBI last year. As for where things are headed, 2021 already seeing a 16% increase in murder. Brody Carter, CBN News.
Folks, when you get behind the scenes, what is Black Lives Matter? Well, of course it matters, but who started it? Well, there were three women who said we are trained as Marxists. It was a Marxist organization that started something by that name, and then, of course, they pushed it way, way beyond that. And then there's something called Antifa, which has its origins way back in Europe, and it had to do with an anarchist concept of destroying the civil authority of the nation. And that has slipped into our consciousness, and so city after city were enthralled with Antifa, and they were going to, quote, defund the police. Seattle was going to do away with its police. The Twin Cities were going to do away with its police, and it's small wonder. Why would a policeman put his or her life on the line to defend a population that did not have his or her back? Why would you do it? If you were being reviled, you wanted to get out. And so they have resigned in droves. So we don't have adequate policing. And when those riots took place a little while ago, nobody wanted to arrest any of them. They tore down buildings, they attacked people, they set up separate zones, and nobody acted, and the city governments were bankrupt. So now, you know, what is it? The Bible says they've sown the wind, and we have reaped the whirlwind.